I wanted to make a clarification for everyone. I had a discussion today with Dr. Bomber. It was a very sour discussion. We almost, no, I'm kidding. No, we talked about the PKN model, right? And he told me that some of you in the multiple choice circled that the PKN model is no leak off. Well, let me be clear about this. Probably, I think I said this, but let me repeat it again. The PKN model assumes this geometry, the one that you see over here, and this is the geometry of the KGD. Probably this will be useful in your exam too. The equations that are over here and that are over here and that you see in the notes, those equations that are relatively simple, in order to develop those, you assume constant injection rate and no leak off to get to those equations. But the PKN model by itself, you can add leak off to that. It just gets a little bit more complicated. So how do you do that? Then you consider leak off. The simplest way is to consider this type of Carter leak coefficient. So if now your injection rate, or what it goes into the fracture, it has some loss into the fracture because of leak off, you have to consider that. And actually, in that case, if you do have leak off, the model goes into being called PKNC, and the C is for the Carter leak off. Okay. So, strictly speaking, you don't necessarily need no leak off in the PKN model, but you do need it to get to this simplified equation. All right? But Dr. Bowman told me that he will give you the points in case you chose no leak off. But remember, okay, no leak off would mean just for these equations, the simple equations. And the same for KGD and the penny fracture model. Remember that the width depends on the volume fracture, and the volume fracture depends on the injection rate. Okay, so I would like to continue talking about the determination. Please be quiet, guys. And the determination of fracture height based on stress logs. So we talked a little bit about this on Friday, and I'd like to finish this topic by talking a little bit more about strain and stresses. And let's see how we get to, guys, please be quiet, okay? If you have to talk, just you can go outside. All right, so let's see what is the logic here. We know that sedimentary rocks usually are put on top of each other, so we always have layers. And rocks tend to be different, so they will have different mechanical properties, different transfer properties, and many times we're going to see that how do you measure Young modulus for formation evaluation? Now that you know you are studying for that exam. What do you use? The sonic log, right? So with the sonic log, you could determine a Young modulus and you could determine a Poisson ratio. And let's imagine for this case that I should have made this a little bit bigger, but I'm going to do it later on the right. Let's say that we have here a sandstone. Well, that was not supposed to be a sandstone. In the middle of the sandstone, which is sandwiched by a carbonate. And it results that from well logging, you see that the Young modulus of the carbonate is higher than the Young modulus of the sandstone. And in addition to that, you run some hydraulic fracture tests, and you get to calibrate a tectonic strain which is constant for all of these formations. So we know the more difficult or the longer version of this equation, but basically remember that always a stress is stiffness times strain. So if we multiply something which is in this case constant with depth, and the Young modulus varies with depth, as a result what we're going to get is a stress, and let me change in this case this to total stress. We're going to get a stress that also varies with depth, and the result is going to be that, again, if the strain is the same and the stiffness changes, that in the carbonate we're going to get a higher stress than in the sand. And what is the implication of this? Well, as we said before, we know that always hydraulic fractures tend to grow perpendicular to the minimum principal stress. In this case, we're going to assume that the horizontal stress is the minimum principal stress. And why is that? Because we said that nature is lazy, right? And it always tries to minimize the work done. And in this case, if we have a variation of stress with depth, nature is going to do the same. So if you were to, let's say that you have a vertical wellbore into this sandstone, and you make some perforations in the middle of the sandstone, and you start pumping, how do you think is going to be the shape of that hydraulic fracture when you just start pumping? I'll let you think about that while I'll draw the carbonate. So try to picture in your mind what you might expect, and we'll do that in just a sec. Okay, so all right, so there we have the carbonate, the sandstone. If you start injecting, we're going to say in this case that the minimum principal stress is going to be in this direction. So if this is let's say X, Y, Z, I'm saying that S3 is in direction X, okay? All right, so I start injecting and fluid comes out of the perforation. What would you expect? Let's try to think on the geometries that we saw before. PKN or radial or KGD, what do you think? Just at the very beginning. Don't limit yourself to the radial geometry. And why is not focusing? Okay, so don't limit yourself to the radial geometry just based on this direction. It could be in any direction. So if you start pumping, then the fracture is going to start small, right? We're assuming that perforations are just in this direction. So it will start as a plane perpendicular to S3, and probably something like that. And probably you don't see it very well right now, but I'm going to make this obvious as the fracture grows. This is a plane that is coming out of the paper and is perpendicular to S3. As you continue pumping, the height grows, and also the length grows in direction perpendicular to the paper, and it will grow as long as S3 is more or less the same, which is in this region, and then it will get to the fracture barriers. What's going to happen afterwards? What do you think? It will continue growing, but now it will grow more into direction Z. It's always growing direction Z, okay? But it doesn't extend in direction Y, to the top or to the bottom. As you remember from the PKN model, each time the fracture gets larger, as time increases, the net pressure also gets larger. So I'm going to finish this example here, but at some point, when you have a very long fracture, the net pressure required to have that long and wide fracture may be so large that it overcomes this difference, and therefore it could continue extending on the other two directions. But that will depend on the length of the fracture and how much the difference is. But our concept now is just to see which are these spots of low stress, to try to identify those, and when we identify those, we're gonna say that for relatively small net pressures in which you do not overcome the difference, this is going to be your fracture height. So that's how you determine the fracture height. So that's the most important part, and which is the conceptual part. Any question about that? Yes?
What direction is it propagating in the beginning?
It's growing in the plane YZ. Always grow in the plane YZ. Okay? Until it hits that barrier, and then it doesn't grow anymore in direction Y. But just continues in direction Z. Okay, so you have to do this in in the homework, and excuse me, and you're gonna find something like this. All right, so try to do it on your own, okay? But the data I've used in this example is the same I gave you. So you will see if you get something similar, and I also zoom in a particular, at a particular depth, but try to see if you see something similar to this. And your objective is going to be that after you build this stress log, and you tell me, for example, if you have the perforations done right at this depth, what would be the hydraulic fracture height? And if it will go, in which direction it will grow. Okay. Let me give you some hints for the homework, okay? You already know how to calculate vertical stress. In the problem of the homework, I've given you a section, not the entire depth. So for the first data point, which is, I think, something like 1,000 feet, you're going to have to assume what is the stress at that point. Consider this is a place onshore, and just take as the rock mass density the first point that you see in that data. So that's going to give you the initial stress. And after that, you use bulk density and you compute the rest. Okay? You also have data of sonic velocities, P and S. With these two, you can calculate the dynamic Young modulus and the dynamic Poisson ratio, just with these equations. Then you have to compute the static YAM modulus, and that's just going to be equal to this factor FDS, which is the factor that converts from dynamic to static, and which in the homework I think is 0.65. So just multiply the YAM modulus that you measure with the well logging measurements to that coefficient, and you will get the static modulus. After you get all of that, this is a mistake. This shouldn't be mu. This should be nu, NU. Okay, I'll correct that. After you do that, once you have vertical stress and you have pore pressure, you can compute the effective stress. And I'm also giving you what are the tectonic strains. And after you do that, you can use these equations. You know effective vertical stress, you know the tectonic strains, you know the plane strain YAM modulus, and there you have everything you need. So the only thing you have to do after that is to calculate these stresses and to interpret what these stresses mean for hydraulic fracture. This is what is called sometimes a stress log, and some other times it's also called a one-dimensional mechanical earth model, because it tells you what is the variation of stress with depth. Okay, so what we have discussed about stress log, fracture height, and what we talked about before about the geometry of a fracture, and what we talked before about fluids going into the fracture, defining what is the width, defining what are the rates as functions of viscosity, width, and that with leak off. That is basically everything that goes into a hydraulic fracture simulator. It's just that, okay? So in the future, if you use a hydraulic fracture simulator, the most popular ones are one which is called FracPro, and another one which is called Gopher. And basically what they do is exactly what we have seen. They use well logging data, so they determine this mechanical earth model. They couple that with the fluid injection, leak off, and fracture geometry to determine what is the resulting fracture. But it's exactly what we have seen so far. And here I have one example of the results that you will get from such model. The first image is the stress log, and notice in this case how that varies with depth. In this case there are two pay zones, so if you were to perforate just this interval, what a hydraulic fracture simulator will predict. Now this is not the simple elliptical shape that we did before, but now the width varies with height, and what is predicted in this case is that if you fracture here, your fracture very likely will not go down because stresses are higher, but it will go up. It will find some regions of low stress where it's going to grow a lot more than in others, like here at the bottom, and it will grow up again until, in this case, it finds another sweet spot to grow, which is that one. And if there is a stress barrier, then it's not going to grow anymore. And you put all of these things together, and you get the hydraulic fracturing simulator. So again, here you have the width in the center of the fracture, And here you can see the length of the fracture as a function of depth, and in color the width, where red is wider, and there is nothing, there is no width, and this is smaller. You have a question, Mr. Moen.
Why is there a fracture when we have no perforation?
Because you perforate here and you start injecting here, but as soon as the fluid gets into the rock and you have a fracture, the fluid just going to move through the fracture. And in this case, we do not have like the time-lapse event of fracture propagation, but this one starts here, the perforation, and then grows up and sideways. And then as it propagates, it moves up to regions in which you did not have a perforation. So let me show some examples here. This is the software I was telling you about, FracPro, and I think that they do not have many images, but probably we can find a few. But it's exactly what I told you before. You just put in all those equations together. So here you see you have information from well logs. It matters a lot what kind of rocks you have, what are the mechanical properties, and based on that, depending which are the intervals in which you select to have your perforations, the fractures are going to grow up and to the sides depending on those mechanical properties. And the width now is not going to be simple elliptical, but it's going to vary with depth. And you can see all these funny shapes over here. Yes?
What are the colors inside the fracture?
The width. This is the width in this case. So the width tells you how wide the fracture is depending on each location. You see, for example, here at this point there is apparently a region of high stress, and that's why the width is a little bit lower at that particular location. You have a question?
So is from your previous example, the one on the notes?
Yeah.
Is there a correlation between the width and the length, or the other? The other digital.
Which one?
From the
colored one.
The colored.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah. See how like the bottom fracture is longer?
It
but
has
it
the
has a
longest
thinner-
length, but it has the narrowest width.
Yeah. But the fracture at the top is
So
shorter.
all red is more or less the same width, right? So all around here, the fracture is more or less has the same width.
Wait, what?
So okay,
It doesn't look like that in the top graph.
here,
Yeah, isn't the top graph and the bottom graph supposed to represent the same thing?
yes.
But clearly you can see the width are different. Or are you saying that they're nominally about the same? It doesn't matter.
Are about the same here. You cannot differentiate the colors. Okay, but you're saying if the width depends on the fracture, if there is a straight relationship between that.
The length and the width, whether there was like an inverse proportionality or a direct proportionality.
So remember that the width depends on the geometry of the fracture, and one of those parameters is length, but also depends on the properties of the formation. The softer the formation, the bigger the width is going to be. So for this particular case, I think that what you're catching is that here the width is smaller, but you have a longer fracture, and here it's wider, but you have a shorter fracture. Well, very likely in this case, the rock is just much softer in here, and that's why the width, even though the length is shorter, the width is a little bit higher. So let me come back to the example over here. Okay, so for a long time, we were just caring about doing these fracture designs for a simple a single fracture, right? But nowadays, this is one example, okay, but I'm going to pull another one. We want to design these fractures to have multiple of those fractures next to each other. And it gets quite a bit more complicated. So let me jump to the other one that has a nicer example. And here you will see some examples of these geometries. Okay, let me download this. It's really easier. Okay, so this software does exactly the same as the things we have done before. But now, notice you can have a one-dimensional mechanical earth model, or you could also have a three-dimensional mechanical earth model, where now that you have a horizontal wellbore, it's very important to see how the properties also vary along the wellbore. How can you do a three-dimensional mechanical earth model? Probably here you see the answer. What can you use? I mean, sometimes you just have wellbores, right? Well, what else can you use to build these 3D models? What? Seismic, right? You can use seismic. Seismic models will tell you more or less, not with a very high degree of precision, but it will tell you more or less where the horizons of the rocks are. And then you can refine that with your well logs, and you can build 3D models. And if you have 3D models, now you can simulate these fractures also in 3 dimensions. So noticing here, again, this is probably a better example. Again, the color is the width. Notice how the fracture geometry is not just, there is no constant fracture height. Right? Probably example, it's a little bit better over here and over there. Why? The width, remember, is going to be, or the height is going to be the largest next to the wellbore, because that's where you have the highest net pressure. But if that net pressure is not so high closer to the tips, the fracture might just concentrate on regions of low stress. And if you put multiple fractures together, this is more or less what you might see. This is more or less the state of the art in commercial hydraulic fracturing simulators. However, there is still a few more things that we have to discuss in order to understand this well. There is usually one assumption in these kind of models that in reality is not true. Can you tell me which one? Can you see, in in this model we have incorporated mechanical properties that vary with space, stresses that vary with space. Can you see something about those fractures that may look a little bit unrealistic?
Linear direction?
Which direction?
It goes directly outward from the wellbores? Yeah. Straight or other?
Straight fractures, planar fractures, right? And that's one assumption that we have been doing, that all of these models do, which in reality may not be right. And that's what we're going to discuss later on. But keep in mind that most of these hydraulic fracture simulators, they assume that. Sometimes they may assume fracture interaction by reducing the width in the following fracture, but as a matter of fact, sometimes fractures may curve and bump into the other fracture if they are too close. So this assumption is sometimes it's not super realistic. Okay, Here's some nice examples of fracture height. And you can check in more detail this document if you are interested. But this is the direction in which we're going, okay? All right, so let me get out of here. My objective is that you know what goes into those simulators. Oh, by the way, I added a video, no, not a video, but a link about Scott Sheffield's lecture, in case you didn't see it or if you want to watch it again. That day or the day before, I talked to Scott Sheffield. He was telling me that in the Permian now, every time they're using less and less the conventional service company services for fracturing, like Schlumberger or Halliburton, and there are more local companies and medium to small size companies that are doing the fracturing. And one of those, he told me, is growing a lot. In case you guys are interested and you don't see directly, or you don't get an internship directly with Schlumberger or Halliburton, the big ones, there is another one. There is one which is called Pro Petro, that he told me that he's doing an excellent work and is having a very high efficiency in their fracturing. All right, so let's talk now about multi-stage hydraulic fracturing. By the way, guys, we're getting towards the end, and I guess that there are a few more people than what we had on Friday, but again, I'd like to propose you to have the final exam, the final day of class. I think it's May the 10th, 1 p.m. Everyone agrees with that?
Yes.
Okay, I'll send an email, and if someone cannot make it, why not?
I have 5 tests in 2 days.
Okay, well, I'll see how many people tell me that they cannot make it, and and then I'll take a decision. Okay? Yes.
Can you post practice exams or practice like from first
I will not, because I do not do that for the final exam. I will post a guideline with questions about what you should study. And you know, I'm not going to pull the statistics right now, but they are uploaded in Canvas. The midterm 2 was more difficult than midterm 1. And you can see that in the results. You can find yourself. I told you that midterm 1 will be the easiest, right? Midterm 2 probably is the most complicated one, because there are a lot of new things that you have to know. But midterm 3, or the final exam, is going to be a little bit easier, because these are concepts that are not too difficult to understand and to apply, and there are not too many kind of problems from which I can take different things. And all the problems that you see in the homework and then you see in my notes, that's exactly what you're going to see in the midterm. So it's going to be one of those. So it's not going to be too difficult. I can tell that probably it's going to be a level of difficulty in between the first and the second one. But again, this is time to make it up in case you didn't do well in the first two. Yeah.
Is it going to be mainly focused on after exam 2?
Okay. So good question. It's going to be all about hydraulic fracturing, but you have to know all the things that we have done before. Okay. For example, you have to know, if I give you the orientations of the breakouts of a wellbore, based on that, you have to know how to place a lateral for multi-stage hydraulic fracturing. You have to know that. You have to know how to calculate vertical stresses, horizontal stresses, something we have done before, but now applied to this. Okay? And some of you guys have another question? Yeah.
Since we're doing it with the final within an hour,
Yeah.
will we have the same amount of questions for them?
You have the same amount of questions, yeah.
Will it be the same ratio of true or false statements to?
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. You have a question?
Yeah, I felt like for midterm 2, we get too many points on the multiple choice were worth a little bit more.
It was the same than before. It was the same than the first midterm. It was, yeah. It was 12, 12, and 12, and then 32, 32, and 32. No.
More points on the application
Maybe. I'll think about that, okay?
The multiple choice is like a 50-50 chance.
Yeah, I didn't bring statistics again, but those were, I saw that most of you had those that answered correctly on the multiple choice. Mr. Cron, you have a question?
Oh, I was just going to ask, since we're talking about the tests, can I ask you a question about the Young's modulus question? Yes.
Okay. What about it?
Is it supposed to be true or false? I've heard conflicting answers.
Well, if you have a particular argument, I like that you send me that by email, okay? All right. Okay, so multi-stage hydraulic fracturing. So what is the objective? For a long time, we have been fracturing formations to basically to increase production rates, right? And why? Because when you make a fracture, the surface area in contact with the wellbore increases, and therefore, for the same bottom hole pressure, now your production is much higher than before. So, with the vertical wellbore, and if this is your minimum principal stress, if you make a fracture that is going to have a wing in the other direction, this is what you get. However, the issue with the vertical wellbore is that you can just place one fracture, right? The whole idea with horizontal wells is to take advantage of the geometry of the well and just to use a single well conveniently oriented, and by now we know that that has to be, if SH mean is a minimum principal stress, we're going to use horizontal wellbores, and they have to be drilled in the direction of the minimum principal stress, so that at different positions along the wellbore you can place multiple fractures. So just now with one wellbore you can have a lot more fractures than before. In this example, 6 fractures, right? You could have done that with a with vertical wellbores, right? But you would need 6 vertical wellbores, and a lot of more facilities on the top to connect those 6. So at the end, it makes more sense. It's more economic to drill one horizontal wellbore and to do multiple fracture stages. So before, we looked for something which is not a design parameter, but something that you have to determine to what is the fracture height. What you can determine, and it depends on the amount of fluid that you inject, is going to be the fracture length, right? And then there's going to be the fracture width too. But now with the horizontal wellbore, you have a few more variables that you have to take into account. And probably the most obvious one is going to be how long those wellbores are going to be. And that is going to be, we'll just call it LL, the length of the lateral. That's something that you have to design. It's going to depend on many things, but this distance has been growing consistently with time. Before, the laterals were relatively short. Today they are 2 miles, 4 miles, sometimes more. But that's a design parameter. And what else you have to design in here? Let's say that we already have the fracture height, we already have the fracture length, and you're going to have to decide also what is the distance between fractures. Let me put a disclaimer right now about this and about what we said before. For some of these simplified models, we're going to assume these fractures are planar, okay? But later on, we're going to talk about that and to see how that sometimes the logic that is not true. But let's assume for now that these fractures are planar. So if those are planar, then you can assume that you can set a distance between the fractures. All right, so how do you do these multi-stage hydraulic fractures in the field? By the way, I put a link of a very nice video. It's actually, I think, quite realistic in some of the things visualizing here. Oh, sorry about that. I'm not going to play the entirety, okay? But here, if you watch this video, you see an animation about fracturing, perforations, and then production. Wait, where is the production? It's somewhere around here. Okay, there. How production goes through the wellbore, okay? So it's about 6 minutes, so I strongly recommend that you watch that. But we're gonna talk more. It's a little bit old, the video. It's about 6 years old. So there is something there that is done differently today. And probably we won't have time to talk about that today, but we'll do it next time. But what is done in the video is what I'm going to show over here. So how do you do these fractures? So let's do a top view of the wellbore. Basically, what is done is after you do your wellbore, you isolate a section, and then you make perforations in the casing, and you inject fluids to create a fracture. So that would be your fracture number 1, okay? So you plug, you perf, and you inject, and you create a fracture. Of course, we're gonna be talking later on about this, right? But I'm not gonna make all of this like with the full geometry, but remember that we need to put propan in it. We're gonna talk about propan schedule later on, but basically you don't inject propan at the very beginning, you inject it ramping up later on. So you put the plug, perforation, and then fracture, then you move on, put another plug.
Wait. Don't you put the plug first?
Yeah,
Okay.
so the plug, this is the next plug.
Okay.
So the plug, and then perforation, and then the fracture, that would be number 2, right? And then I'm gonna try to line up my fractures here. and so on, right? Plug, perf, fracture, plug, perf, and fracture, plug, perf, and fracture, and the last one, plug, perf, and fracture. And after you're done with this, you drill through the plugs, and then you lower the pressure, and this will start producing. We have been doing this type of vertical wellbores more or less since the 50s, and probably some people claim that maybe before that. And up to today, we still do in vertical wellbores a hydraulic fracture, right? Not every single wellbore is horizontal. This type of plug and perf and fracture, just with a few perforations, it was something that was done, I would say, more or less from the 90s to the 2010. But now there is something different, and is that for every stage there are multiple perforations, so you have multiple fractures coming out from each stage, and those are called clusters. Okay, we're gonna get to that a little bit later on, but it's important that first we try to understand how we determine this distance between stages or between fractures in order to understand the other one. You have a question, Mr. Moore?
Yeah, just wondering if you perforate and you frac so close to the arc, it's going to hit each other?
Well, that's what we're going to get into now. So, you know, tentatively, you may say, I'm going to put these fractures as close as possible, because if I do that, for the same wellbore, I'm going to have more fractures, and I'm going to have more surface area in order to produce out of this wellbore. Well, the problem is that if you get them too close, then they start to interact with each other, okay? And also, if you get them too close, sometimes it may not be economical. Even if they're all straight, making all of these fractures, it requires a lot of sand, fracturing fluid, that it may not be also economical, even if they are parallel to each other, okay? But we're not going to get into the economics of this. We're going to talk mostly about the mechanics, okay? So, if you get these fractures too close to each other, let's say that you plug, you perf, you create the first fracture, and then you are ready to create the second one. So you plug again, and then perforate and create the other one. Sometimes if this fracture is too close to the other, this fracture, remember that this fracture is propped, okay? So let me, just for this first one, let me make it obvious. The fracture is propped, is occupying the space that before was occupied by rock, now is occupied by sand. So what do you think is going to happen with the stress in this direction? Would it be higher or smaller or the same than before?
Higher.
It's going to be higher, right? And how much higher? It depends on the width, and also it depends on what? So remember, sigma is equal to what? Effective stress. This is exactly what we did before. It's a stiffness times strain. This is the width of the fracture. This is the Young modulus of the rock. So the stiffer the rock, the bigger is going to be this additional stress in here. Okay, we'll pick it up from here, guys, on Wednesday. Oh, by the way, if you don't have your exam and you want your exam, please come by my office and I'll give you your exam. I forgot to bring it today.